Ever wondered why so many Japanese role-playing games are about 4 teenagers using the power of friendship to save the world and kill an evil god? Well, wonder no more, because today we're tackling the first instalment in the series that introduced this and many other conventions of the genre. Hello and welcome to the second episode of The Patient Gamer, brought to you from the stunningly sunny south of Spain. Today we're taking a look at the seminal classic Final Fantasy I, so put on your black hats, grab your elemental crystals, and let's jump into it. Originally released in 1985 for the NES, the first Final Fantasy is famously known as a last-ditch effort from its developer Squaresoft to stave off bankruptcy. A top design team including legendary names such as Hironobu Sakaguchi and Nobuo Uematsu collaborated to make their last big hurrah, a game heavily inspired by the recent success of rival company Enix's Dragon Warrior, and also borrowing many elements and monster designs from Western RPGs like Ultima, Wizardry, and Dungeons & Dragons. I recently played through the Game Boy Advance remake, and as a fairly recent convert to Final Fantasy, I was very interested in seeing how the series began. This first game gets overshadowed by many of its more famous younger brothers, and I wanted to go back to basics and see what it was that captured the imagination of RPG fans in 1985 and kick-started one of the longest running and largest franchises in gaming history. Now, there are a few ways to play the first Final Fantasy. The original NES version is probably the one most people would recognise, and I certainly checked it out when I booted up my recent NES Classic purchase. However, there is a serious flaw with this original version of the game that makes it almost unplayable now that we no longer live in the Stone Age of gaming. In short, attacks you make against an enemy in a single round in FF1 on the NES fail if the enemy has already been killed by a previous attack. There is no way to see an enemy's health, and so you're stuck doing a ton of mental math trying to remember roughly how much health enemies have in every single fight. Compound this with enemies who can heal their allies or themselves, and you have an old-fashioned, frustrating and overly complicated battle system. Is this an insurmountable challenge? Certainly not. And will some old school gamers relish the way the game doesn't pull its punches? Absolutely. But for me personally, this level of unnecessary difficulty simply adds a lot of frustration to combat, and the developers agreed with me. When the early 2000s rolled around and Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance, a handheld console with pretty much the same power as some of their earliest home consoles, Square, who had merged with their former rivals Enix to become the gelatinous cube known as Square Enix, smelt the sweet tang of money. They ported a bunch of their old Final Fantasy games onto the system, and with Final Fantasy I in particular, they decided it was time for more than just a fresh coat of paint. They fixed this awful part of the combat system, updated the sprites and music, and bundled Final Fantasy I together with a similarly remade Final Fantasy II, released it on the Game Boy Advance, and called it Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls. This is an excellent remake that preserves the spirit and pretty much all of the design of the original game, while streamlining, modernising and refining its gameplay. This is the kind of remake I love because it is simply a better experience than the original, and uses the benefit of hindsight to fix things that audiences in 1985 wouldn't have known were annoying. Unfortunately, since the GBA itself is almost 20 years old at this point, and physical copies of the Dawn of Souls cartridge are going for 150 smackaroos on Amazon, I had to don my trusty tricorn and go sailing on the 7 seas of piracy. By which, I mean I googled the game, went to the very first result, which was a ROM site, and downloaded it within about 10 seconds. You could totally play the iOS version if doing this disagrees with you, but the touch controls seem goofy, and I have a soft spot for the GBA, since it was the first handheld console I owned. So, GBA it is, and right off the bat you've got Mr. Uematsu's masterful score letting you know you're in for a good time, with the classic prelude theme that features in every entry from the series. Hit start and you'll be prompted to name your Warriors of Light and choose their classes from a list of the classics. You've got your hitty strong warrior, your fast thief, your bare-knuckled monk, and the Final Fantasy standard of red, white and black mages that would become a staple of the series. A helpful opening crawl informs you the world is dying, in the throes of destruction, and the people patiently await the arrival of the prophesied Warriors of Light, each bearing an elemental crystal to save them. A party of adventurers off on an epic quest to save the world from destruction. Gosh, does that sound familiar? Yeah, this game is totally hitting my fantasy G-spot. The story is simple, as befits a simple premise. You start off saving a princess from an evil knight, and her grateful father opens up a bridge to the north of his kingdom, proclaiming that you must truly be the prophesied Warriors of Light, and letting you access another part of the land. Thus we set off on our quest, and soon a pattern sets in. Find another town, walk around talking to people until they tell you what it is they need, and then head off to the next dungeon to kill the big monster at the bottom, who needs to be taught a sharp lesson about how blighting the world is just not okay. Plot is kept light, as the highlights here are the battle system and the scale of the world you're exploring. Soon enough you'll begin acquiring the various modes of transport that open the world up to you. First a ship for crossing oceans, then a canoe for crossing inland rivers, and finally of course the airship, for flying merrily over the impassable mountains and accessing all of the dungeons you couldn't get to before. Airships would go on to become a signature part of the series, and their inclusion in this first entry highlights just how early the Final Fantasy games began developing a unique identity. Now, Final Fantasy is old school. I mean, it was around when they were pouring the foundations for the old school, and it shows in its quest design, or lack thereof. An early questline has you clearing a town of pirates to gain a ship, travelling to meet the Elven King, who sends you to find a crown in order to gain a crystal, to return to the witch Matoya, who gives you a jolt tonic to wake the sleeping Elven Prince before you open up the next part of the world. This fetch quest design isn't really bad, just basic, and the sheer lack of any fluff is refreshingly direct in a genre often known for being very waffly. All of this is done on the expansive world map and a variety of themed areas, from caves to dungeons to shrines to ancient castles, to even more far-out inclusions like active volcanoes and infinite underground deserts. Somebody has to represent the side of evil, however, and these depths are filled to the brim with dozens of different enemy types. You'll likely see all of these as you traverse the world, even the many palette swaps. Thankfully, the random battle music is catchy as hell, and roaming around the world doesn't feel like a chore due to the brief nature of fights. There's a neat little system of elemental magic going on that your black and red mages can learn that supplements the standard turn-based battle system. Thunder spells for water monsters, fire spells for ice monsters, etc. It's basic, but it adds extra layers to the battle system that reward checking out monsters in the bestiary that you can access from the menu. The early parts of the game live up to the fantasy part in the name, as Sakaguchi's tabletop RPG love exposes itself in the hordes of goblins, ogres and wargs you fight. But things get more experimental later on, with beings pulled from various mythological sources to provide a smorgasbord of cool enemies to defeat. I have some quibbles about the game. The dungeon design is bland. Many of the game's dungeons use the limited top-down perspective to funnel you into redundant, samey-looking rooms, and some dungeons are explicitly designed to frustrate the player, with circuitous routes and environmental objects designed to block pathways and force you to waste time searching for other routes. All of this serves to give the game more chances to throw random encounters at you, and whilst I love the enemy designs and full-screen fight backgrounds, the lack of variety in many dungeons leaves them as little more than a slog that must be fought through to get to the deepest level and fight the boss. Said bosses, while all well designed and full of visual flair, are often pushovers, and this brings me to my second problem with the game. It's too easy. Maybe it's because the remake's designers didn't account for how you weren't wasting attacks on already dead enemies, or maybe it's because when you hit the Elven town early on, 2 levels of magic become available, and I grinded the money to buy the best spells, but for a significant portion of the game I stomped through bosses in a couple of turns or less. Even formidable ones like a vampire that could cast insta-kill death spells on your characters fell in 2 well thought out rounds of attacks. Most spellcaster bosses never even got a chance to cast any spells. Once your characters are properly equipped and you've saved up the money for the good magic spells, battles are quick and brutal. The sheer amount of battles still threatens to weigh you down if you don't properly manage your party members' health bars, but a few healing spells will sort that problem out. This is more of a dungeon crawling game, where you wade through hordes of enemies looking for loot and big bosses to kill, and that's definitely something I can get behind. Square Enix seems to have realised this balance issue, however, and this version of the game includes 4 new dungeons, unlocked as you defeat the 4 elemental fiends corrupting the earth. These dungeons are long, contain varied rooms, and at the end often have a choice of boss encounters, with rare and unique loot to be obtained from each. These bosses were some of the first in the game to really give me a challenge, and I relish the opportunity and wholeheartedly approve of the inclusion of these extra dungeons. It's just a shame they only start to liven things up in the late game. Despite my quibbling, despite its archaic mechanics, and despite the bare-bones gameplay, this game has a charm and a life to it that makes it stand out. A product of its time, Final Fantasy I's design shows its age, and it lacks many of the features that would go on to become staples of its own series. That being said, I like this game. I like the sprites, I like the battle backgrounds, I like the magic system. I particularly like the expansive world, although I do wish for a little more direction than esoteric hints and cryptic messages. I can certainly recommend it to fans of old school JRPGs and anybody interested in the history of RPGs as a whole. Pick it up on iOS if you don't mind the weird controls, and you're guaranteed 20 hours or so of old-fashioned JRPG fun. So guys, that was Final Fantasy I. Let me know down below if you've played any games in the series and why I should take a look at it. Now, whilst next time on The Patient Gamer I'll be tackling something other than an RPG, because frankly I need a break, I have only covered half the content on the Dawn of Souls cartridge. We've still got Final Fantasy II to look forward to, and I for one am looking forward to jumping further into the series. Thanks for watching guys, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, it always helps. I'm off to have a beer in the Spanish sun. See you next Friday with another video. Cheers.